Calhoun and Maddox wore their authority like armor. They flashed it in their voices, in their stares, in the way they boarded a black man's fishing boat without hesitation. They thought they had found an easy target, someone they could shove around without consequence. They barked orders, ripped open supplies, forced him down on the deck, while the morning sun and passing boats bore silent witness. They thought he was powerless. They thought he was invisible, but they didn't realize he was Admiral Langston Graves, active duty Navy, and the man who would turn their arrogance into a national reckoning. What happened next would be a lesson in justice and the price of underestimating the wrong man. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The sun stretched low across the open water, spilling liquid gold over the gentle swells. Morning mist still clung to the surface in thin ribbons, stirring and dissolving wherever the boat's modest wake disturbed them. Admiral Langston Graves stood alone at the stern, one hand steadying the fishing rod, the other resting casually on the weathered railing. His personal boat, a simple 24-foot center console he had restored himself, bobbed with a comfortable, familiar rhythm beneath him. No aids, no reports, no meetings stacked like sandbags against his time. Just the clean smell of salt air, the low hum of the engine idling, and the kind of quiet that felt earned. He wore an old Navy ball cap pulled low against the brightening sky, mirrored sunglasses masking sharp eyes that had seen too many shores under too many flags. His hands, calloused despite years at a desk, worked the line with a practiced patience. This, he thought, was the rarest kind of freedom. The kind not scheduled, not saluted, not measured by briefings or signatures, but lived one breath at a time. In the distance, seabirds tilted and glided, their calls sharp and clean against the endless stretch of blue. He watched them, amused by the way they skimmed the water's surface with effortless grace. Every so often he leaned down to check the cooler by his feet, where two respectable red snappers waited for dinner. Nothing fancy, just a quiet meal to end a quiet day. Langston adjusted his line slightly, feeling the subtle tug of current against the bait. A small smile touched the corner of his mouth. This was his America. Not the endless arguments back in Washington, not the bitter headlines that crowded his inbox every morning, but this vast and open water, this honest pull of fish and tide answering to no one but the earth itself. The horizon shimmered in the heat, a blur of endless blue meeting endless sky. He squinted against the light, his senses, ever disciplined, picking up a disturbance. A dark shape, small but distinct, peeled away from the haze. A boat, moving faster than usual for this stretch of open water. Not another fisherman. Langston's brow furrowed slightly beneath his cap. The vessel grew closer, its shape resolving into the crisp lines of a Coast Guard patrol boat. White hull, sharp angles, authority unmistakable even at a distance. The engine's whine reached his ears a moment later, louder than it should have been for such a serene morning. He shifted his stance slightly, not alarmed, but aware. It wasn't unusual to see patrols out here. Langston had commanded more than a few joint operations himself over the years. Search and rescue, drug interdiction, disaster response. The Coast Guard wore many faces. Still, something about the speed, the directness of their approach, made the peaceful air around him thin just a little. He reeled in slowly, calm and deliberate, setting the rod back into its holder. His fingers brushed the small leather wallet tucked securely inside the console. His identification, his badge, his proof of who he was in every formal sense. But a familiar instinct whispered against the back of his mind, the same instinct that had served him well in darker corners of the world. Wait, watch, see what they do first. The patrol boat cut its engine in a brisk maneuver, drifting broadside to his vessel with the casual confidence of lawmen used to being obeyed. Two officers stood at the rail, hands resting lightly but obviously on their belts, weapons and radios gleaming in the sun. Both wore the standard blue uniforms, their faces set in expressions that could have been carved from stone. One, taller and broad through the shoulders, gestured sharply for Langston to stand clear of the console. The other scanned the boat with quick, darting eyes, like a hawk sighting prey. No greeting, no polite request, just command, unsoftened and unearned. Langston kept his posture loose, his hands visible, his voice easy when he spoke. "Morning," he called out, the drawl slight but deliberate, the greeting a measured offering of peace. The taller officer, Calhoun, his name tag read, responded only with a curt motion, a sharp tilt of the head. The second officer, younger, leaner, shifted his stance to the edge of the patrol boat as if preparing to leap aboard. Something cold pressed at the edges of Langston's calm, not fear, but a slow, gathering certainty. He hadn't done anything wrong. No broken lights, no erratic sailing, no emergency signal. Yet here they were, bearing down on him like he was a threat simply for being here, afloat in his own waters. The quiet peace of the morning settled a little heavier against his skin, as if the sun itself hesitated, watching to see what would happen next. Langston adjusted his stance subtly, his face composed, his mind sharpening. The fishing trip was over. The real fight was about to begin. The patrol boat's hull bumped gently against Graves's vessel, the sound muted by the lap of the waves. Officer Calhoun made the jump first, heavy boots thudding onto the deck with a possessiveness that spoke louder than any warrant. Officer Maddox followed a moment later, lighter on his feet, but mirroring Calhoun's stern, suspicious expression. Langston Graves stayed exactly where he was, hands relaxed at his sides, sunglasses hiding the sharp glint in his eyes. He didn't flinch as Calhoun closed the distance with brisk authority. "Name," Calhoun barked, voice sharp as a breaking wave. "Langston Graves," he answered, tone even, refusing to meet hostility with anything but calm. "Where are you headed, Graves?" Maddox demanded, glancing around the deck as if expecting to find a confession lying between the coiled ropes. "Nowhere but here," Graves replied. "Fishing." Calhoun gave a humorless chuckle. "Funny. Fishing with all this gear," he said, nodding toward the modest tackle neatly stored near the console. "Nothing suspicious about it. Nothing extravagant. Just the tools of a patient man at sea." Graves kept his hands visible, the stance of someone who knew exactly how quickly situations like this could spiral. "May I ask the reason for this inspection?" he said politely. Calhoun's mouth twitched. "You match the description," he said flatly. "Black male, center console boat. Out here alone." Graves said nothing at first. He simply tilted his head, the slow movement speaking volumes. "And what description would that be, exactly?" he asked, voice low but firm. Maddox moved with jerky efficiency, yanking open a cooler without asking permission, flipping the lid carelessly to inspect the contents. A couple of freshly caught fish, a bottle of water, a folded jacket. Finding nothing, he slammed it shut hard enough to jolt the boat. Calhoun stepped closer, invading Graves's space with the blunt, unthinking confidence of someone certain they could not be questioned. "You think you're clever?" Calhoun snapped. "Out here in the middle of nowhere? No witnesses?" Graves kept his voice measured, letting none of the slow-burn anger show on his face. "I'm asking for probable cause," he said again. "By law, you must state it clearly before conducting a search." Maddox, now at the side hatch, ripped open a storage bin, flinging out emergency flares, a life vest, even the sealed first aid kit, sending it clattering across the deck. He wasn't searching anymore. He was desecrating. A small boat puttered by in the distance, a couple glancing over curiously at the scene unfolding on Graves's vessel. Another fishing trawler slowed, the operator shading his eyes against the morning sun. Langston said nothing to the watching boats. Let them see. Let them remember. He turned his focus back to Calhoun, his words steady as bedrock. "You're violating procedure," he said. "You have no probable cause. You have no grounds for—" The blow came fast. Calhoun's hand shot out and grabbed Graves by the shoulder, the fingers tightening like iron hooks. Without a shred of warning or legality, he wrenched Langston downward, forcing him onto the deck, the impact jolting through his knees and palms. Pain flared, but Graves gritted his teeth against it, his pride wounded far more than his body. "Hands behind your back," Calhoun growled, voice loud and commanding, ensuring it carried across the waves to every bystander now slowing to watch. Graves complied, movements precise, resisting the surge of anger boiling under his skin. He would not give them the satisfaction of a struggle. Not yet. Plastic cuffs clicked tight around his wrists, the edges biting deep. Maddox stood over him now, rifling through the boat with growing viciousness, ripping open compartments, scattering neatly organized supplies to the wind. Gear slid across the deck, spare fishing rods clattering into corners, tackle boxes overturned, hooks and lures spilling out like broken promises. Graves looked up through the lenses of his sunglasses at Calhoun, whose face was flushed with exertion, and something uglier. A thrill, perhaps, at asserting power so easily. "You're making a mistake," Graves said, his voice low, a final warning offered out of principle, not hope. Calhoun snorted, nudging Graves's shoulder with a boot. Not hard, but just enough to remind him who he thought was in charge. "No, you made the mistake, boy," he said, "thinking you could hide in plain sight." Graves closed his eyes for a moment against the sting of it. Not the insult itself, but the certainty that no explanation, no paperwork, no rank would have changed what had just happened. The sound of things breaking behind him, Maddox upending another hatch, ripping a seam in one of the seat cushions, filled the air like an anthem of destruction. Another boat slowed nearby, its occupants murmuring among themselves, cameras rising, recording. Good. Let them record it all. The cuffs bit deeper into his wrists as Graves flexed his hands slightly, gauging the give. His breathing stayed slow, even as the horizon narrowed into a sharp point of clarity. This could not go on. And it would not for one more minute. The deck rocked gently as Maddox rifled through the next storage compartment, the low creak of disturbed hinges breaking the uneasy silence that had settled over the boat. His gloved hands moved with reckless urgency, scattering emergency rations and carefully folded tarps across the deck like refuse. A small, neatly wrapped plaque, a retirement gift from Graves's first submarine command, clattered to the floor and splintered along the edge when Maddox kicked it aside without a second thought. Graves remained kneeling where Calhoun had forced him, the plastic cuffs biting into his wrists, the deck hard and hot against his palms. His back was straight, his body still, but inside, every inch of him coiled tighter with each indignity dealt to his vessel, to his history, to the life he had built with discipline and sacrifice. He said nothing. He would not grant them the satisfaction of anger. Not yet. Maddox yanked open another hatch, tearing through a carefully packed emergency bin. A laminated photograph slipped from a side pouch and fluttered loose across the deck. A simple, worn picture of a younger Graves standing beside his late wife, both smiling in front of base housing long since demolished. The photo landed just beside Graves's knee, face up and vulnerable, but Maddox did not even glance at it. His boot ground it thoughtlessly into the damp decking as he pivoted toward the next compartment, searching not for contraband, but for any excuse to justify the violence he clearly ached to inflict. The low thrum of another engine grew louder, a soft vibration threading through the water and steel. A small pleasure boat had drifted closer, the couple aboard standing at their railing, their faces drawn in tight, worried expressions. A second trawler slowed, the captain shading his eyes with one hand while the other steadied a raised phone, the lens catching every brutal second unfolding across the battered fishing vessel. Graves caught their movements in the mirrored lenses of his sunglasses, saying nothing, making no appeal. The witnesses, would see for themselves. Maddox, emboldened by the growing circle of attention, grew sloppier, his search devolving into vandalism. He ripped open storage bins, flinging life jackets, flares, and meticulously organized tackle across the deck. A survival knife, standard issue for any responsible mariner, clattered free from a mounted bracket near the helm, the blade flashing briefly in the sun as it tumbled. Maddox snatched it up with a small grunt of satisfaction, holding it aloft as if it were a bloody trophy. Calhoun, still perched near the console like a watchman claiming the spoils of war, laughed under his breath. "You don't just come out here on your own," Maddox sneered, waving the knife lazily before tossing it onto the console. "Not unless you're hiding something. Running something." Graves breathed slowly through his nose, willing his muscles to stay relaxed, even as fury simmered in the pit of his stomach. He watched, silent and still, as another boat idled closer, more phones lifted, more silent witnesses gathering in the periphery. Calhoun shifted his stance, crossing his arms in a pose meant to project dominance, but Graves caught the tell. A slight tightening around the eyes, a defensive stiffness in the shoulders. For all his bravado, the man was aware, on some level, that something was slipping beyond his control. "You think you're smart?" Calhoun barked suddenly, breaking the momentary quiet. "You think we don't know your kind? Come out here where you think no one can see you, no one can hear you. Thought you could slip by easy, huh?" Graves lifted his head slightly, the mirrored lenses of his sunglasses catching the sunlight and throwing it back in an unflinching blaze. His voice, when he spoke, was low, measured, and carried the full weight of a life spent commanding men in far more dangerous waters than these. "You're violating procedure," he said, each word delivered with the deliberate, calm precision of a scalpel. "You have no probable cause. You have no grounds for boarding, much less searching or seizing my property." Calhoun's lip curled, an ugly sneer breaking across his face as he took a step closer, the edge of his boot tapping against Graves's shin in a mockery of force. "We don't need probable cause when you match a description," Calhoun snapped, voice rising so the nearby spectators could hear. "Black male, center console boat, alone in restricted waters." Graves remained silent for a long moment, his heart thudding slow and steady in his chest, the tension gathering like storm clouds over an open sea. A crackling voice came over Calhoun's radio, the words half lost in the salt-laden breeze but clear enough. Backup was en route, requested under the pretense of a non-compliant suspect needing further assistance. The second Coast Guard vessel was visible now in the distance, cutting fast across the water toward them, a plume of white spray trailing behind it. But it was still too far to intervene, still a shadow against the endless stretch of blue. Maddox turned to glance at it, straightening slightly with a newfound arrogance, as if the mere promise of reinforcements absolved him of the crimes he was committing in plain view. Graves tilted his head just a fraction, measuring the moment with the unerring precision that had kept him alive through battles far deadlier than this quiet assault. He had endured their humiliations long enough. The world had seen enough. The tide had shifted, and now the current carried all the power to him. The approaching backup still had distance to cover, which meant the time to act, the time to reclaim his dignity, was now. Langston Graves closed his hands slowly into fists against the deck, his breath deep and steady, feeling the moment crystallize in the charged air between himself and the men who had thought they could strip him of everything he was with impunity. They were wrong, and they were about to learn just how badly they had miscalculated. Graves flexed his hands subtly against the plastic cuffs binding his wrists, feeling the slight give in the material. Cheap, standard issue. Not built to withstand a man who knew precisely how to break restraints with leverage rather than brute force. He shifted his wrists, drawing a slow, deep breath, and with a sharp, violent twist of his shoulders combined with a quick yank outward, The cuffs snapped apart with a brittle crack, masked by the slap of a wave against the hull. For one heartbeat, the officers did not notice. They were too busy gloating, too certain of their control. Graves moved. In a single flowing movement, Graves pushed off the deck, twisting his torso and driving his shoulder into Calhoun's midsection with bone-jarring force. Calhoun grunted, staggering back, but Graves did not relent. He drove upward, using the momentum to rise to his feet, pivoting smoothly and ramming his elbow into the officer's ribs in a sharp, calculated strike. Calhoun stumbled sideways into the console, the breath whooshing out of him in a ragged gasp. Before Graves could press the advantage, Maddox moved, faster than his partner, less reckless, but still nowhere near the level of a man trained for survival in hostile territories. Maddox aimed a quick, desperate jab toward Graves's ribs, catching him just below the left side. The blow was sharp enough to force Graves to shift back, the pain spiking in a bloom of dull fire along his side, but he absorbed it, his feet planting solidly on the deck. Graves countered with a sweeping arm block, deflecting Maddox's next punch with brutal precision. He drove a hard palm into Maddox's sternum, forcing the younger officer back a step. But Maddox recovered quickly, feinting left and swinging right, clipping Graves across the jaw with a wild hook. The impact snapped Graves's head to the side, the world tilting momentarily, before he reset his stance with a growl low in his chest. Pain flared along his cheekbone, hot and immediate, but Graves embraced it, let it sharpen his focus rather than cloud it. His ribs ached from the earlier baton strike, his side stung where Maddox's fist had landed, but he was still moving, still calculating, still in control. Calhoun roared and lunged again, this time leading with a brutal charge aimed at Graves's midsection. Graves sidestepped at the last instant, planting his foot and driving his knee sharply into Calhoun's thigh. The bigger man buckled slightly, but instead of falling, he lashed out with a wild backhand, catching Graves across the shoulder. The blow rocked him back a step, muscles screaming in protest, but Graves turned with the momentum, rolling his body low and sweeping Calhoun's legs from under him in a clean, practiced arc. Calhoun hit the deck hard, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp grunt, but he rolled quickly, trying to regain his footing. Maddox was already charging again, grabbing for Graves's arm in a clumsy attempt at a grapple. Graves allowed the grab, using Maddox's own forward momentum to twist and flip him over his hip, sending the younger man sprawling face-first onto the fiberglass deck with a heavy, painful thud. But still they fought. Calhoun rose with a roar of frustration, blood trickling from his split lip, rage replacing any last remnants of tactical thinking. He rushed Graves like a bull, arms wide, trying to overpower him with brute force alone. Graves dropped low, driving his shoulder into Calhoun's gut again. But Calhoun wrapped thick arms around Graves's torso, lifting him partially off the deck in a crushing bear hug. Pain exploded across Graves's ribs, the earlier baton strike blooming into white-hot agony under the renewed pressure. He gasped sharply, gritting his teeth as he fought against the crushing force. For a moment, the world narrowed to the brutal pressure against his ribs, the sweat slicking his skin, the hard reality of being outmuscled if he did not act fast. Drawing on reserves of strength carved from decades of training, Graves shifted his weight and slammed his forehead forward into Calhoun's nose with a brutal headbutt. The impact was sickeningly solid, a wet crunch followed by a bellow of pain as Calhoun's grip loosened, and he stumbled back, blood gushing from his broken nose. Graves dropped to his knees, coughing, forcing breath back into his battered lungs. His body screamed in protest, but his mind remained clear, razor-focused. Maddox, seeing his partner falter, lunged again with a growl of rage, swinging the baton he had recovered from the deck in a wild overhead arc. Graves barely had time to roll aside, the baton slamming into the fiberglass where he had been a heartbeat before, cracking the surface with the force of the blow. Rolling smoothly to his feet, Graves closed the distance, trapping Maddox's swinging arm mid-strike, twisting it viciously behind the younger man's back in a textbook control maneuver. Maddox cried out, his knees buckling. But Graves gave no quarter, forcing him down onto the deck with a swift, brutal efficiency that spoke of long-forged experience. The deck swayed gently beneath them, the sun bearing down with merciless heat, the slap of water against the hull, the only sound aside from the ragged breathing and grunts of struggle. Graves's vision blurred briefly at the edges. His injuries demanding attention he refused to give. He planted a knee into Maddox's back, pinning him with calculated pressure, while his free hand darted toward his own waist where Maddox had dropped the baton during the scuffle. Calhoun roared again, charging blindly, his face a bloody, contorted mask of rage. Graves pivoted just enough to meet the attack, swinging the baton low across Calhoun's shins, the crack of impact sending the larger man sprawling with a strangled cry. Graves dropped the baton immediately after, refusing to escalate the violence further, and spun to face both men, breathing hard but standing tall. Both officers were down, stunned but not unconscious, crawling toward opposite sides of the deck, as if sheer stubbornness could overcome the skill and discipline that had laid them low. Graves watched them without pity, the ache in his ribs pulsing with every breath, his cheeks swelling, blood drying along the edge of his mouth, but none of it dimmed the cold fire burning in his chest. He had taken their best shots. He was still standing. Calhoun heaved himself upright, blood dripping freely from his broken nose, his chest rising and falling in ragged bursts. Across the battered deck, Maddox wiped a smear of blood from his mouth and shoved himself unsteadily to his feet. The baton clutched once again in his right hand. Both men were battered, humiliated, but far from ready to surrender. Graves watched them both with a soldier's patience, reading the tension in their muscles, the desperation clouding their judgment. His ribs ached with every breath, his jaw throbbed where Maddox's fist had found its mark, and the skin along his shoulder burned where Calhoun's wild rope strike had torn it open. Pain radiated through his body like a second heartbeat, steady and unrelenting. But he welcomed it. Pain sharpened his focus, anchored him to the moment. "You still think you can win this?" Graves asked, his voice low, measured, cutting through the heavy air between them. "You should have walked away when you had the chance." Calhoun spat blood onto the deck, his eyes gleaming with hatred. "You should have stayed down," he growled, advancing again, fists clenched. Graves stood his ground until the last possible second, letting Calhoun's full momentum commit him, before sidestepping with a fluid twist of his hips. Calhoun stumbled past him, off balance, and Graves lashed out with a vicious elbow to the back of the man's head, sending him sprawling face first into a set of overturned storage bins. Maddox charged without hesitation, swinging the baton in a horizontal arc aimed for Graves's midsection. Graves ducked low, felt the whoosh of the baton pass over his back, and drove his shoulder into Maddox's ribs, lifting the younger officer off his feet and slamming him against the side rail with a resonant clang. The impact shook the entire boat, the vibration rattling through Graves's battered ribs, but he held firm, pressing Maddox into the metal with brutal efficiency. Maddox gasped, struggling against Graves's iron grip, his baton dropping from nerveless fingers. Desperate, he threw a wild punch with his free hand, catching Graves across the ear hard enough to send a sharp crack through his skull, stars bursting at the edges of his vision. Graves staggered back a step, blinking rapidly, but stayed upright, the world swaying for a single perilous heartbeat before snapping back into focus. He gritted his teeth against the ringing in his head and moved forward again, driving his knee sharply into Maddox's gut. Maddox folded with a pained wheeze, dropping heavily to the deck, one arm cradling his ribs. Graves turned just in time to catch Calhoun hurtling toward him again, roaring like a wounded animal. There was no technique to it now, only brute force. Graves met the charge head-on, deflecting Calhoun's wild punch with a raised forearm before hammering his fist into the side of Calhoun's jaw with a sharp, punishing hook. Calhoun reeled, arms flailing, but Graves was already moving, seizing the larger man's arm and twisting it behind his back in a brutal joint lock that wrenched a ragged scream from his throat. "You're done," Graves growled, his voice low and implacable against Calhoun's ear. "You lost." He forced Calhoun down onto his knees, planting a hand firmly between the man's shoulder blades to keep him there. Calhoun struggled weakly for a moment longer before his strength gave out, his breath hitching in defeated gasps. Maddox made one last desperate lunge, a hoarse cry ripping from his throat, but Graves pivoted smoothly, catching him mid-charge with a devastating straight punch to the solar plexus. Maddox crumpled instantly, hitting the deck with a dull thud and curling into a coughing, heaving ball. Breathing hard, blood dripping steadily from a gash above his brow, Graves straightened slowly, his silhouette framed against the bright glare of the sunlit sky. He moved without pause, retrieving heavy-duty zip ties from one of the nearby compartments, equipment the Coast Guard officers had ironically brought aboard themselves, and went to work with calm, brutal efficiency. First Calhoun, who cursed and bucked feebly as Graves wrenched his arms behind his back and cinched the ties tight enough to cut off any thought of resistance. Then Maddox, who whimpered a protest but lacked the strength or will to fight anymore. "You're going to answer for every second of this," Graves said quietly as he secured the last restraint. His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. No need for volume or threats. Both men lay bound at his feet, battered, defeated, their earlier arrogance crushed into the bloodied fiberglass under the blazing sun. Graves moved methodically through the wreckage of his boat, gathering the discarded weapons, the baton, the sidearms, the knife, and locking them securely in a storage hatch near the console. He double-checked the bindings at the officers' wrists and ankles, ensuring they were tight but not cruel, disabling without excessive harm. Satisfied, Graves crouched beside Calhoun, removing the man's radio from his belt and turning it over in his hand. He held it up in front of Calhoun's bruised, swollen face, letting the weight of the moment settle between them like a drawn blade. "You're going to call it in," Graves said. "Exactly the way I tell you. No lies. No games." Calhoun's lip curled in a sneer, but there was no strength left behind it. "You're finished," Calhoun hissed, his voice raw and cracked. "When they get here, you're finished." Graves leaned in closer, his blood-smeared face unreadable behind the mirrored sunglasses, his voice a quiet, lethal promise. "No," he said. "I'm just getting started." He dropped the radio onto Calhoun's chest and stood up, his shadow falling across both officers like a shroud. "Call it," Graves ordered simply. Now, there was a long, heavy pause, where the only sounds were the faint lapping of the water against the hull, and the distant whine of the second patrol boat still closing the distance across the waves. Slowly, with trembling fingers, Calhoun picked up the radio and keyed the mic. "Patrol 1 to base," he croaked. "Situation secure. No resistance. Standing by." The words hung in the hot air, undeniable, recorded not only over the Coast Guard channels, but by a dozen civilian phones still filming every moment from nearby boats. Langston Graves stood silent as stone, battered, bleeding, but wholly unbroken, watching as justice began to tighten its slow, inevitable grip around the throats of the men who had dared to believe he would kneel. The second patrol boat surged alongside, its engines rumbling like a storm against the calm stretch of water. Heavy boots thudded onto Graves's deck in a sudden, rehearsed chorus, weapons drawn, voices barking sharp commands into the thick, sun-blasted air. "Hands where we can see them! Now, get down on the deck!" The squad moved like a tightened fist. A dozen men in full tactical gear, faces grim behind mirrored sunglasses and taut jawlines, all expecting to subdue a violent criminal, all believing they were stepping into a scene already decided by the narrative their comrades had spun over the radio. Graves did not flinch. He stood tall amid the wreckage of his boat, bloodied but composed, his battered face a silent rebuke to the story they had been told. The two bound officers lay at his feet, struggling weakly against their restraints, their uniforms stained with sweat and defeat. Slowly, deliberately, Graves raised both hands, palms outward, his every movement measured and unmistakably non-threatening. The squad hesitated for a fraction of a second, reading the unexpected control in his posture, the absolute lack of panic or aggression. One of the backup officers, a lieutenant by his insignia, stepped forward, weapon raised but wavering slightly, his voice barking commands by rote more than conviction. "Identify yourself," he snapped. "Right now." Graves moved with calm precision, reaching with two fingers toward the chest pocket of his torn shirt. Every weapon in the squad zeroed in on the movement, tension crackling in the hot air, but Graves showed no fear. He drew out a slim leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming gold ID badge and an unmistakable set of credentials, the lettering crisp and undeniable even at a glance. United States Navy, Langston Graves, Admiral. Active duty. The world seemed to halt. A ripple moved through the squad, the kind of shift that could not be hidden or controlled. Shoulders lowering fractionally, eyes widening behind dark lenses, mouths parting slightly in sudden, stunned comprehension. The lieutenant nearest him blinked rapidly, his jaw tightening as if he had been struck. For a long, heavy moment, no one spoke. The sea itself seemed to quiet, the breeze dropping. The only sound the faint slap of water against the hulls, and the distant buzz of curious civilians still filming from their boats. Graves's voice cut through the silence like a scalpel, cold, sharp, and unflinching. "I shouldn't have had to tell you," he said. The words dropped into the air with the weight of a gavel, final and damning. No one moved. No one breathed. Several of the backup officers exchanged quick, panicked glances, the certainty they had worn just moments before crumbling into confusion and dawning horror. Graves let the silence stretch a moment longer, watching them with a gaze honed sharp by decades of command. His body battered, but his presence filling the deck with a force greater than any weapon. "You came in here ready to shoot a man you didn't even know," Graves said, voice low, but carrying across the entire boat. "You came in here with no facts, no proof, just the word of men who thought they could hide behind their badge." The lieutenant licked his lips nervously, lowering his weapon a fraction, his hands suddenly unsure. "I am Admiral Langston Graves," Graves continued, enunciating every syllable with cold, controlled fury. "Active duty, and you just pointed guns at a senior officer of the United States Navy without justification, without identification, and without cause." Behind him, Calhoun groaned weakly, his head lolling against the deck, while Maddox lay silent, staring at nothing with wide, glassy eyes. From the corners of the scene, the civilian boats buzzed like a hive stirred to life, their occupants whispering furiously, phones still raised, recording every word, every reaction, every grim, unfolding second of a story that was already spinning out of the Coast Guard's control. The lieutenant finally lowered his weapon fully, the barrel dropping toward the deck, as if weighed down by the enormity of what he had just stepped into. "Sir," he stammered, his voice cracking, We didn't know. We were responding to—" Graves raised a hand, cutting him off with a slight motion that stopped the lieutenant mid-sentence. "I know exactly what you were responding to," Graves said. "You were responding to a story, a lie, a system that taught you to see a threat first, a man second." He tucked the ID wallet back into his shirt with deliberate care, his blood-smeared hands steady, his expression hard and unyielding. "You're going to stay right there," he said, nodding toward the squad still frozen at the edge of the deck. "No one leaves. Internal affairs, congressional oversight, And the Navy's own investigators will want to hear every word of what happened here today. The lieutenant swallowed hard, nodding stiffly, the color draining from his face. Graves stepped back slowly, his injuries screaming with every move, but his posture remained iron straight, his presence unbreakable. In the distance, more boats approached. News crews now, the glitter of long-range lenses catching the light, drawn by the viral footage already spreading like wildfire across social media. Justice was coming, and Langston Graves intended to meet it, standing tall, bloodied but undefeated. The first news alert streaked across television screens and mobile devices less than an hour after the second patrol boat returned to shore, carrying with it the battered evidence of a confrontation that had already begun to unravel. Footage, pieced together from a dozen civilian boats, flooded the internet almost in real time. Shaky handheld videos showed Admiral Langston Graves kneeling on the deck of his vessel, plastic cuffs biting into his wrists, while officers rifled through his belongings and tossed them aside with careless abandon. Another angle captured the brutal surgical precision with which Graves had defended himself, turning the humiliation forced upon him into a quiet, devastating reassertion of dignity. Across every platform, a single headline began to dominate. Black Navy Admiral assaulted by Coast Guard officers, viral outrage erupts. Inside a sterile, windowless security office at the marina, Graves sat rigid and silent in a plastic chair, a battered first aid kit resting unopened on the table nearby. His ribs screamed with every breath, the bruises across his side and cheek already darkening, the split at the edge of his brow leaking slow, sticky warmth down the side of his face. But he refused the repeated offers of medical attention from the dockmaster and the security personnel who hovered nervously in the hallway. He wanted the world to see the marks they had left, unaltered and unhidden, recorded in every frame of every image that would circulate long after the sun had set on this day. Down the hall, Calhoun and Maddox sat separated under armed guard, each man cradling his injuries with a growing awareness of the consequences rolling toward them like an unstoppable tide. In the lobby, the backup crew shifted uncomfortably, their weapons holstered, their faces betraying the growing realization that whatever story they had been told, whatever assurances they had clung to when they first boarded Graves's boat, with drawn weapons and arrogant certainty, was crumbling under the unforgiving light of public scrutiny. Commander Evelyn Hart arrived 20 minutes later, her entrance as brisk and polished as a woman used to smoothing over disasters with a few sharp words and a few carefully chosen gestures. She wore her uniform crisp and immaculate, the bars of her rank gleaming beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, her expression a mask of regret painted onto a foundation of calculation. She placed a manila folder on the table between them, her hands folded neatly atop it, her voice pitched just loud enough to convey concern without inviting witnesses. "Admiral Graves," she began, her tone dripping with rehearsed sincerity, "first and foremost, let me extend my deepest personal apologies for what has happened here today. This incident does not reflect the values or the professionalism of the United States Coast Guard." Graves said nothing. He merely stared at her through the battered lenses of his sunglasses, his swollen face an impassive wall against which her words shattered uselessly. Hart pressed forward, sliding the folder an inch closer across the table, her fingers never fully releasing it. "In recognition of the unfortunate misunderstanding, and in the interest of resolving this matter quickly and respectfully," she continued, "the Coast Guard would like to offer you a private settlement, a formal apology, financial compensation, and a thorough internal review." Her smile flickered, brittle and tense. "This way," she said, "we can avoid unnecessary public complications for everyone's benefit." Graves reached out, placing a heavy, bruised hand atop the folder. He felt the flimsy paper bend under the slow pressure of his fingers. For a long moment, he said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch and tighten between them like a noose. When he finally spoke, His voice was quiet, but lethal, each word weighted with the force of a man who had seen too many lies wrapped in velvet tones. "You think you can fix this," Graves said, "by throwing money at it. You think dignity can be bought like damaged goods at a bargain." Hart's smile wavered, just a flicker, but Graves saw it, and he pressed the advantage. "This is not about avoiding embarrassment," he continued. "It is about accountability, something you seem to find inconvenient." Hart's mask cracked further, the professional calm she wore like armor slipping at the edges. "Admiral," she said, her voice tightening into something closer to a threat, "you're risking an awful lot. Careers are made or broken by how gracefully they handle moments like this. No one is above political reality." Graves leaned forward slightly, the movement slow, deliberate, his battered face implacable. "I have risked my life for this country more times than you can count," he said. "I have stood under enemy fire without flinching. I have carried the bodies of better men than you or I will ever be. And I have done it without asking for thanks, without expecting safety, because duty demanded it. But I will never, protect corruption under the guise of loyalty." He lifted the folder with 2 fingers, held it up briefly as if weighing it, then let it fall back onto the table with a loud, dismissive slap. "You want this to disappear," Graves said, rising slowly to his feet, despite the screaming protest of his ribs and battered muscles. "You want it buried before the wrong people ask the right questions. But I am not here to make you comfortable. I am here to make you accountable." Hart stood as well, her features schooled back into icy control, though the flush creeping up her neck betrayed her. "You're making powerful enemies," she said, her voice dropping low, her hands curling subtly at her sides. Graves stared at her for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was calm and resolute. "Good," he said. "It means I am aiming in the right direction." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, his steps slow but unwavering, leaving the folder and Hart's carefully laid trap crumpled and useless on the table behind him. Outside, the parking lot had transformed into a frenzy of flashing cameras and shouted questions. Journalists pressed against hastily erected barriers, microphones raised high, demanding answers, demanding justice. Graves ignored them all, moving through the chaos with the steady momentum of a man who had weathered storms far worse than this, his battered frame carrying the undeniable weight of truth and righteousness. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the full reckoning was gathering strength, and Langston Graves had no intention of stopping until every single one of them, every officer, every commander, every accomplice, faced it. Langston Graves stood at the center of a swirling storm far greater than anything even he could have anticipated. What had begun as a quiet fishing trip gone wrong had become a national reckoning, a boiling point decades in the making, and he had no intention of letting it cool before the full extent of the rot was dragged into the light. The formal demand for investigation was delivered less than 24 hours after the footage exploded onto every major news network. Graves, battered but resolute, strode into the Department of Homeland Security offices wearing his full-dress uniform, his ribbons gleaming against the deep navy fabric, his injuries still raw and visible on his face, a living testament to the consequences of unchecked authority. He did not hide them. He wore them like armor. The Secretary of Homeland Security, red-faced and tight-lipped, had tried to urge patience, to suggest internal reviews, to offer vague assurances about reviewing procedures and disciplinary recommendations. Graves had not raised his voice. He had not needed to. His demand had been simple, direct, and utterly unmovable. There will be a full federal investigation. Public, independent, uncompromising. It was not a request. It was a line drawn in stone. Hours later, standing on the steps outside the federal building, Graves found an unexpected ally waiting for him. Senator Maya Lattimore had made her name long before politics, as a civil rights attorney who had taken impossible cases and carved victories out of hopelessness through sheer will and unrelenting truth. She was a striking woman in her late 50s, her hair silvering at the temples, her posture ramrod straight, her dark eyes sharp and unflinching. She met Graves at the bottom of the steps, ignoring the swarm of reporters shouting her name, and extended her hand in a firm, decisive gesture. "Admiral Graves," she said, her voice clear and carrying, "you will not fight this battle alone." Graves clasped her hand firmly, nodding once in gratitude, the mutual understanding between them requiring no elaborate exchange of words. They were both soldiers, in their own ways. They both knew the cost of standing alone against an institution determined to protect itself. Within hours, Lattimore called a press conference on the Capitol steps, standing shoulder to shoulder with Graves. Cameras flashed, microphones bristled, and when she spoke, the country listened. "We will not allow the uniform to be used as a shield for injustice," she declared, her voice steady and powerful, cutting through the din of reporters. "We will not allow systemic racism to hide behind protocol. Admiral Graves's case is not isolated. It is the symptom of a deeper sickness, and it will be exposed." The pressure began to fracture the Coast Guard's leadership almost immediately. Inside headquarters, panic set in. Younger officers, many of whom had long grown frustrated with the old guard's silent complicity, found new courage in Graves's defiance. Whispers turned into grumbles, grumbles into emails, and soon signed letters of concern began circulating, demanding transparency and reforms. Meanwhile, the senior command, used to operating behind closed doors and relying on silence to shield them, scrambled to contain the fallout. Closed-door meetings stretched into long, angry nights. Blame shifted like a restless tide, some arguing for sacrifice to protect the institution, others clinging to outdated loyalties that could no longer withstand public scrutiny. It became clear that a superficial internal review would not satisfy the tidal wave of outrage sweeping across the nation. Graves's insistence on a real investigation, backed now by Lattimore's political force, left them with no choice. When the announcement finally came, it was thinly veiled in bureaucratic language, but the truth behind it was plain. A full, independent inquiry would be conducted, and it would be led by someone they could not easily control. Captain Rosario del Rio was an officer with a reputation that preceded her, known for her uncompromising dedication to truth, her refusal to bend to political pressure, and her methodical, almost surgical approach to rooting out corruption. She had cut her teeth investigating cartel-linked shipping routes and had once taken down an entire regional command after uncovering a bribery scandal that reached all the way to Washington. She was not, by any measure, the kind of investigator the old leadership had wanted. But public pressure had robbed them of the luxury of choosing someone they could manipulate. Del Rio accepted the assignment without fanfare. She arrived at Coast Guard headquarters 2 days after the press conference, a woman of medium height and sharp bearing, her dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense braid, her uniform immaculate, her gaze cold and analytical. She requested full access to all personnel involved. She demanded body cam footage, service records, disciplinary files, internal emails. She made it clear in her first briefing that no one, not enlisted personnel, not officers, not commanders, would be immune from scrutiny. And she made it equally clear that anyone found obstructing her investigation would be named publicly. The message was unmistakable. The era of silent protection was over. From his quiet hotel room overlooking the Potomac, Graves watched the first signs of real movement unfold on the news. His bruises were beginning to fade, but the resolve burning inside him had only sharpened. He knew this would not be swift. He knew it would not be clean. The system would not yield easily. It never did, but for the first time he saw a real crack forming in the walls that had protected men like Calhoun and Maddox for decades. And he intended to drive a wedge into that crack until the whole rotten edifice came crashing down. Captain Rosario del Rio worked in silence, the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that hollowed out rooms and unsettled even the most confident liars. She set up a temporary command center inside the Coast Guard headquarters, turning a sterile, windowless office on the third floor into a war room. Thick files, seized hard drives, and printed emails covered the tables like wreckage scattered across a battlefield. She did not trust the official systems. She brought her own team, auditors, and forensic analysts hand-picked for their loyalty to truth over rank. Investigators who had earned their reputations rooting out corruption in the deepest corners of federal institutions. Every document was catalogued, every discrepancy was logged, every obstruction was noted with grim, clinical detachment. It took her less than 48 hours to realize the rot was far worse than anyone had feared. The first sign came from a cluster of personnel complaint files, routine on the surface, mundane in their existence. But when cross-referenced with witness statements, civilian reports, and unpublished internal memos, the pattern emerged like a ghost across a battlefield. Over a span of 10 years, hundreds of complaints had been filed against Coast Guard officers for harassment, racial profiling, and excessive force. Civilians who had been stopped without cause. Boaters of color searched aggressively without warrants. Families detained for hours without explanation. Written complaints had been filed by the victims, recorded in the system like dying echoes, and then buried under layers of procedural dead ends. Nearly all of them had been closed without investigation. Del Rio leaned back in her chair, staring at the spreadsheet she and her team had constructed, the names blurring into a painful testament against the institution that had sworn to serve and protect. She saw the dates, the locations, the familiar patterns of dismissal, and at the bottom of nearly every incident report, stamped like a curse, was the same signature: Commander Evelyn Hart. Each clearance form, each dismissal, each internal review marked as resolved, no further action, bore her name, her sign-off, her official blessing. Del Rio felt a slow, burning anger gather beneath her ribs, a cold and relentless fury that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with betrayal. Betrayal of the oaths they had all sworn. Betrayal of the trust placed in them by the very people they were meant to protect. She rose from her chair, moving to the far wall where a whiteboard had been hastily mounted. With a black marker, she began sketching the connections, linking cases by location, by personnel, by timeline. Red lines crisscrossed the board like a spider's web, each strand connecting a failure, each node a life disrupted or destroyed by arrogance disguised as authority. The evidence was overwhelming. It was not a handful of bad actors. It was not isolated mistakes. It was a systemic pattern of abuse and concealment, sanctioned and sustained at the highest levels of command. And at the center of it all stood Commander Hart, the architect of silence. Del Rio's team continued to dig, working around the clock. They unearthed emails between Hart and regional commanders, thinly coded messages urging discretion in sensitive cases. They found drafts of public statements never released, pressuring victims into signing non-disclosure agreements under the guise of resolution. They uncovered training protocols quietly rescinded for field officers, cultural sensitivity workshops canceled, oversight committees disbanded, internal audits postponed indefinitely. Each discovery layered more weight onto the growing mountain of evidence, a structure so massive that even the most determined spin could not hide it from the coming scrutiny. Del Rio called a closed-door meeting with the Coast Guard's acting commandant late that afternoon. She arrived carrying 3 heavy binders under one arm and a thumb drive tucked securely into her jacket. Her uniform was immaculate, her boots polished to a mirror shine, her expression carved from stone. She placed the evidence on the long oak conference table with deliberate care, the thud of the binders landing like a judge's gavel striking the block. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying no anger, no drama, only the brutal finality of truth, "we have identified a pattern of systemic misconduct spanning more than a decade, involving hundreds of cases of racial profiling, abuse of authority, and unlawful detention of civilians." The acting commandant paled, his knuckles whitening where they gripped the edge of the table. Commander Evelyn Hart personally signed off on the closure of the vast majority of these cases, Del Rio continued, flipping open the top binder to reveal a page bristling with official seals and signatures. She facilitated their suppression, issued false clearances, and, in some instances, altered official reports to eliminate evidence of wrongdoing. The silence that followed was suffocating. "We are no longer looking at a public relations problem," Del Rio said, each word slow and deliberate. "We are looking at institutional failure and criminal negligence at the highest levels of command." The acting commandant rubbed a trembling hand over his face, his eyes darting toward the sealed doors as if hoping for an escape that would not come. What do you recommend?" he asked hoarsely. Del Rio closed the binder and straightened to her full height. "Immediate suspension of Commander Hart," she said. "Full cooperation with federal investigators, and unrestricted release of all internal documentation to the Congressional Oversight Committee." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "If you refuse," she added, her voice cold as steel, "the documents will be made public anyway." The choice was not a choice at all. Outside the window, dusk had fallen over the Capitol, the lights of the city flickering to life one by one. The storm was gathering, dark and inevitable, and no one in the Coast Guard's senior leadership could pretend they did not see it coming now. Back in her makeshift war room, Del Rio pulled out her phone and dialed a number she had memorized, but never thought she would use. It rang once, then connected. "Admiral Graves," she said when he answered. "You were right. It's worse than we imagined. Much worse." On the other end of the line, Graves said nothing for a long moment, but Del Rio could feel the cold satisfaction in the silence between them. Not joy, never that, but the grim recognition that the fight he had started would not be fought in vain. "Send me everything," he said quietly. Del Rio smiled, a hard, fleeting curve of her lips. "It's already on its way." The weight of truth, when carried by determined hands, could break even the strongest walls, and as Admiral Langston Graves and Senator Maya Lattimore prepared to bring their evidence before Congress, it became clear that no shield, no uniform, no network of political favors would be strong enough to withstand what was coming. Graves sat at the long oak table inside Senator Lattimore's private office, the walls lined with books on law and governance, sunlight slanting through tall windows, catching on the medals that lined his dress uniform like quiet sentinels to a lifetime of service. Across from him, Lattimore paged carefully through the thick dossier Captain Del Rio had compiled, her brow furrowed in grim concentration as she absorbed the full magnitude of the betrayal laid bare within its pages. When she closed the final file, her hand rested on it for a moment, fingers splayed as if to anchor herself to the steady gravity of the task ahead. "This," she said, her voice low but steady, "is no longer just about you, Admiral. This is about everyone they silenced." Graves nodded, the deep ache in his ribs a constant reminder of why he could not, would not, back down. "We speak for them too," he said. "Everyone they ignored, everyone they buried." Together, they walked the wide marble halls of the Capitol, their steps steady, their purpose unshakable. News crews lined the corridors, flashes bursting like lightning, microphones extended like weapons. Graves ignored them all, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his jaw set, a living contradiction to every lie that had been told about him. The Congressional Oversight Committee convened 3 days later, in a room packed to bursting. Representatives from every major news outlet filled the gallery seats, Civilians lined up outside in the halls, holding signs, some printed, some hastily scrawled in pen and marker. Justice for Graves, no more silence. Protect those who protect us. Senator Lattimore opened the hearings with a statement that would be played and replayed across every media channel for weeks to come. For too long, she said, standing before the committee with Graves seated quietly behind her, those entrusted with power have wielded it not to protect, but to oppress. Today we pull back the veil. Today we demand answers. She submitted the full findings from Captain Del Rio's investigation into the congressional record. Not a summary, not a sanitized report, but the raw, unfiltered truth. Thousands of pages documenting a decade of abuse, suppression, and institutional rot. Screens around the hearing room flickered to life as footage began to play. Not just the viral videos from Graves's confrontation, but clips gathered from civilian witnesses on the water that day. Different angles, different voices, all converging into a single undeniable narrative. One showed Graves calmly asking for probable cause, only to be shoved face first into the deck. Another captured Maddox ripping open storage bins, tossing Graves's personal effects overboard with casual cruelty. Another caught Calhoun's sneering voice as he muttered racial slurs he had foolishly believed would be lost to the open air. The room grew colder with each passing frame, the weight of the evidence bearing down on every soul present. But the most devastating blows came not from the images, but from the testimonies that followed. Victim after victim stepped forward, their voices steady, but thick with the memory of humiliation and fear. A black father who had been detained with his teenage son during a routine sailing trip. A Latina woman whose boat had been boarded and torn apart without cause, while her young children sobbed in terror. An elderly Korean veteran forced face down on the deck of his fishing boat, questioned at gunpoint for nothing more than daring to be there. Each story painted another stroke across the portrait of systemic failure, of unchecked prejudice hiding behind the language of authority and safety. Graves sat among them, listening, his face carved from stone, offering silent solidarity to every voice that cracked, every hand that trembled, every memory laid bare before the world. Captain Del Rio took the stand last, her presence calm, methodical, devastating. She laid out her investigation with surgical precision, connecting every buried complaint, every falsified clearance, every dereliction of duty back to the deliberate decisions made under Commander Hart's leadership. She cited dates, names, memos, showing how internal protections had been dismantled not by accident, but by design. The committee members, many of whom had entered the hearing with carefully neutral expressions, now sat stiff and stricken, their pens forgotten, their notes abandoned in the face of such irrefutable truth. When Del Rio finished, she closed her binder, straightened her uniform, and delivered the final cut without hesitation. This was not a failure of a few individuals, she said. It was a cultural failure, cultivated and permitted at the highest levels of leadership. Until it is uprooted completely, it will continue to grow. The silence that followed her words was profound, broken only by the clicking of camera shutters and the barely restrained murmurs sweeping through the gallery. Graves rose slowly to his feet when the committee chairman called him forward, every bruise and cut on his face standing in stark contrast to the medals shining across his chest. He moved with the dignity of a man who had nothing left to prove, only truths left to speak. "I served this country with pride," Graves said, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. "I fought so that all Americans, not some, not the ones who look a certain way, all Americans could stand free. But freedom means nothing if those sworn to protect it become its abusers." He paused, letting the truth settle over them. "This is not just about justice for me. This is about restoring the honor of every good man and woman who wears a uniform, and about finally holding accountable those who have disgraced it." He left the podium without looking back, knowing the floodgates had been opened, and there would be no containing the tide that would follow. Outside, the nation waited, watching, as the foundation of silence cracked and began to crumble. The illusion of unity that the Coast Guard Command had projected for decades shattered within days of the hearings. What had once been a carefully managed image, a seamless facade of discipline, professionalism, and loyalty, began to crumble under the relentless pressure of public scrutiny and congressional subpoenas. Behind the tall stone walls of Coast Guard headquarters, panic brewed like a storm trapped within a brittle cage. Senior officers, once steadfast allies, now circled each other warily, their conversations guarded, their loyalties fraying under the unbearable weight of survival instincts. Private meetings devolved into shouting matches. Fingers were pointed. Files were quietly edited, then leaked. Allies of yesterday became scapegoats of today. Men and women who had sworn loyalty to the institution turned on each other in desperate bids to preserve their own careers, their pensions, their legacies. It began quietly at first. A leaked internal email here, a contradictory statement to investigators there. But within a week, the fractures became visible even to the public. Whispers turned into headlines. Anonymous sources inside the Coast Guard revealed rifts between senior leadership and field commanders, accusations of cover-ups, of orders given to suppress complaints, of direct pressure from senior officers to quash internal investigations long before Admiral Graves's name ever graced the evening news. At the center of the widening maelstrom stood Commander Evelyn Hart, once untouchable, now a glaring symbol of everything that had gone wrong. When the subpoena arrived, hand-delivered by federal marshals, witnessed and recorded by eager reporters, it was not simply a legal formality. It was an unmistakable declaration. She would answer for her actions, and she would do so under the unblinking eye of the nation. The hearing was scheduled for prime time. Public interest was too high, outrage too thick in the air, for it to be hidden behind closed doors. Networks cleared their schedules. Live streams were prepared. Every seat in the congressional chamber filled long before Hart arrived, her once proud uniform now a hollow shell of the authority it once represented. Graves sat silently in the gallery, Senator Lattimore at his side, watching as the woman who had signed her name to hundreds of silenced cries was sworn in under oath. Hart took her seat at the witness table with mechanical precision, her expression carefully schooled into one of professionalism. But the tension in her jaw, the tightness in her hands as she clasped them before her, betrayed the strain she could no longer hide. The committee chairman wasted no time. His voice, sharp and direct, cut through the heavy silence. "Commander Hart, were you aware of the numerous civilian complaints alleging racial profiling and harassment under your command?" Hart's lips parted, the practiced answer forming automatically. But the weight of evidence already submitted into the record made lies perilous. She hesitated a fraction too long, and the cameras caught it. "I reviewed all reports presented to my office," she said finally, her voice flat, brittle. "Those that lacked sufficient evidence were closed according to standard procedure." The chairman leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "And you personally signed off on over 90% of these closures without initiating a full investigation?" Hart opened her mouth to respond, but another committee member, a former prosecutor known for his relentless style, jumped in, his voice rising slightly. "Commander Hart, are you telling us that not once, in over a decade, did you find a single complaint worthy of escalation? Not one case worth a full inquiry? Despite video evidence? Despite corroborating testimonies?" Hart's knuckles whitened against the table. "Procedures were followed," she said stiffly. "Resources are limited." "Resources are limited?" The senator cut in sharply, slamming a thick binder of victim testimonies onto the table with a heavy thud that echoed off the chamber walls. "Resources are not an excuse to violate constitutional rights. They are not an excuse for racial discrimination. They are not an excuse to trample the dignity of American citizens. Citizens who deserved better from the institutions sworn to protect them. The tension in the room thickened until it felt suffocating. Hart's carefully erected walls began to crack. Under the heat of relentless questioning, inconsistencies in her statements multiplied. She contradicted earlier depositions. She downplayed documented incidents. She blamed subordinates for decisions bearing her direct signature. Every dodge, every half-truth, was captured by dozens of cameras and broadcast live into the homes of millions of Americans already sickened by what they had seen. It became clear to everyone watching that Hart was not defending the Coast Guard. She was defending herself, and doing it poorly. In the back of the gallery, Graves watched impassively, his face unreadable. He did not gloat. He did not smile. The spectacle unfolding before him was not a victory, but a grim necessity, a painful public exorcism of an institution that could no longer be allowed to hide its sins behind rank and ceremony. As the hearing dragged into its third hour, the committee dropped its final blow. Captain Del Rio, called forward as a rebuttal witness, presented a damning set of internal emails recovered from encrypted archives. Emails that showed Hart had not only closed complaints, but had actively instructed subordinate officers to discourage further escalation and to frame findings within operational discretion when dealing with cases involving civilians of color. The room erupted. Reporters scrambled to update headlines in real time. Senators exchanged stunned glances. Members of the audience, many of them veterans, many survivors of the harassment, now laid bare for all to see, gasped audibly. Commander Hart slumped slightly in her chair, her face drained of color, her hands trembling where they rested on the table. She no longer answered questions. She simply sat there, caught in the flood of undeniable truth, a monument to the consequences of unchecked power, finally meeting its reckoning. Outside, the nation watched, and for the first time in too long, it saw the machinery of justice beginning to grind forward, slow but relentless. And Admiral Langston Graves, bruised but standing, knew that the war was far from over. But the tide had turned, the silence had been broken, and it would not return. The final confrontation came not under the blinding lights of a congressional hearing, but within the solemn walls of the federal courtroom, where every echo of footsteps, every shuffle of paper, carried the heavy undertone of judgment. Admiral Langston Graves sat silently in the front row of the gallery, his uniform immaculate, the rows of ribbons across his chest gleaming softly under the high arched lights. He bore the visible marks of the struggle no longer in fresh bruises, but in the quiet, implacable way he held himself. Shoulders squared, chin lifted, a man who had been tried and found unbroken. At the defense table, Brady Calhoun and Trent Maddox sat side by side, the distance between them greater than the few inches of polished oak that separated their chairs. Their uniforms were pressed and pristine, but there was no pride left in how they wore them. Calhoun stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles along his cheek trembled. Maddox shifted in his seat, his hands fidgeting in his lap, stealing glances around the courtroom as if searching for an exit that did not exist. The judge, a woman known for her steel temper and unsparing standards, entered without ceremony. A single crack of her gavel silenced the low murmurs of the room and brought the proceedings to order. "Today," she began, her voice cool and carrying, "we hear the final statements before judgment is rendered in the case of Brady Calhoun and Trent Maddox, charged with conduct unbecoming of an officer, abuse of authority, violation of constitutional rights, and dereliction of duty." The prosecution laid out its final argument first, threading together the evidence with merciless precision. They replayed key sections of the civilian footage, each frame a fresh cut into whatever defense the accused might still hope to mount. They reviewed the testimony of witnesses who had seen the events unfold firsthand, the heavy-handed boarding of Graves's boat, the unwarranted search, the brutal force used to detain a man who had done nothing but ask for the law to be respected. When it was their turn, Calhoun's defense attorney rose stiffly, smoothing his jacket with nervous hands, and called his client to the stand. Brady Calhoun stood and made his way to the witness box with the stiff, mechanical gait of a man marching toward his own funeral. He took the oath, sat down, and fixed his gaze somewhere just beyond the judge's shoulder, refusing to meet the eyes of the gallery. "Petty Officer Calhoun," his attorney began, voice carefully measured, "can you tell the court what you believed was happening on the day in question?" Calhoun's voice, when it came, was rough-edged, defensive. "We were acting on a report," he said. "Black male, center console boat, suspicious activity offshore. We were told to investigate." "You believed you were pursuing a potential drug trafficker?" the attorney prompted. "Yes," Calhoun said, his hands flexing against the edge of the witness box. "We didn't know who he was. He fit the description. He didn't comply right away. He questioned our authority. That's when we moved in." "And when did you realize he was an admiral?" Calhoun hesitated, his mouth working for a moment before he answered. "Not until after the backup arrived." The attorney nodded solemnly, as if this explanation should be enough, as if the courtroom would forget the videos showing Graves calm, cooperative, and very much compliant until the violence began. On cross-examination, the prosecution moved in like a scalpel. "Officer Calhoun, did Admiral Graves ever threaten you?" Calhoun shifted uncomfortably. "No." "Did he display any aggression before you laid hands on him?" Another pause, heavier this time. "No." "You escalated without probable cause. You assaulted a citizen in violation of Coast Guard procedures. You humiliated an admiral of the United States Navy. Is that correct?" Calhoun's face reddened. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "I followed protocol," he muttered finally, the excuse falling flat in the silent room. The judge's expression did not flicker. She simply nodded and gestured for the next witness. Trent Maddox rose reluctantly, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. His attorney barely needed to guide him. Maddox, sweating under the heavy gaze of the gallery, poured out a torrent of half-formed justifications the moment he was sworn in. "I just followed Calhoun's lead," Maddox said, his voice high and strained. "He's senior. He gave the orders. I didn't know the guy was important. I didn't know we were messing up." "You thought it was acceptable," the prosecutor pressed on cross, "to tear through a man's property, destroy his equipment, and treat him like a criminal based solely on the color of his skin?" Maddox paled, words stuttering to a halt. I mean, it wasn't about that. We were doing our job," he mumbled. The prosecutor leaned forward, voice slicing the air. "Your job is to uphold the Constitution, not to tear it apart when it suits your prejudices." Maddox swallowed visibly, his mouth working soundlessly before he dropped his gaze to his knees. The gallery remained still, a mass of silent witnesses to a reckoning long overdue. The judge allowed a brief recess, giving everyone, defendants, spectators, officers of the court, a moment to absorb the gravity of what had been laid bare. When the courtroom reconvened, the judge wasted no time. She turned to Calhoun and Maddox, her face grave but devoid of any performative anger. "Brady Calhoun and Trent Maddox," she said, "this court finds you guilty of conduct unbecoming, abuse of authority, and gross dereliction of duty." The words fell heavy and final. "You are hereby dishonorably discharged from the United States Coast Guard, stripped of all pay, benefits, and honors, and permanently barred from federal service. Let the record show that your actions, and your actions alone, have disgraced not only yourselves, but the institution you swore to uphold." Calhoun stiffened in his seat, his face carved from stone. Maddox's head drooped low, shoulders sagging under the weight of it. The gavel struck the block once more. "And now," the judge said, turning toward the gallery, We will hear from Admiral Langston Graves. Every head in the room turned as Graves rose, straightening the front of his jacket with calm, steady hands, and walked forward, each step carrying the dignity of a man who had withstood the worst and emerged not bowed, but unbreakable. Langston Graves stepped to the center of the courtroom, the room falling into a hush so complete that even the air seemed to hesitate. He adjusted the hem of his uniform jacket with deliberate calm, the ribbons and medals on his chest catching the light like old scars, hard-won and irrevocable. His hands rested lightly on the podium, but his posture radiated command, not the brittle authority of rank demanded, but the quieter, heavier authority of respect earned. He waited for a moment, letting the silence deepen until the shifting of papers, the creak of a chair, the shallow breaths of those in the gallery became unbearably loud. Only when he was sure every eye was on him, every ear straining for his words, did he begin to speak. "I have spent the greater part of my life in service to this nation," Graves said, his voice steady, low, but carrying through the room with the force of undeniable truth. "I have worn this uniform in distant lands and in distant seas. I have bled under foreign suns and carried brothers home under the flag we all swore to defend. I did these things not for glory, not for reward, but because I believed, and still believe, in the ideals that this country is supposed to represent." His eyes scanned the faces before him, judges, attorneys, journalists, spectators, some shifting uncomfortably under the raw weight of his gaze. "But belief," he continued, "is not blind, it is not deaf, and it does not ignore when those ideals are betrayed by the very hands sworn to uphold them." He paused, the words heavy in the space between them. "On that deck," Graves said, "on that bright morning, I was not Admiral Langston Graves in the eyes of those officers. I was not a decorated veteran. I was not a citizen exercising his rights. I was simply a black man in a boat, a profile, a suspicion wrapped in skin." He let the words settle, feeling the way they struck the walls of the room and echoed back with terrible clarity. "And because of that," he said, his voice tightening slightly, "they thought they could take my dignity without consequence. They thought that their badges, their assumptions, their unchecked power gave them the right to strip me of everything I had built, everything I had fought for, everything I had endured." He looked down for a moment, gathering breath, not because he needed the time, but because he knew the truth deserved space to breathe. "But dignity," he said, raising his head again, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet, "is not something you are given. It is not something a uniform or a badge can confer. It is something you carry inside you. Something no man, no institution, no act of cruelty can take, unless you surrender it yourself." The courtroom remained utterly still, the weight of his words anchoring every soul in place. "I did not surrender," Graves said. "Not then. Not now, not ever." His gaze flicked toward Calhoun and Maddox, whose faces remained locked in a grim facsimile of impassivity, though the tightness around their mouths betrayed the hollow anger curdling inside them. "You believed you could humiliate me," Graves said, addressing them directly without raising his voice. "You believed that if you pressed hard enough, fast enough, you could force me to bow, to submit. You saw the color of my skin and decided that my rights were optional, that my dignity was negotiable." He shook his head slowly. "You were wrong." Turning back toward the judge, Graves planted his hands firmly on the podium, standing tall, a living contradiction to every stereotype, every assumption, every whispered justification that had fed into the actions of the men who now sat disgraced before him. "I do not stand here today demanding vengeance," he said. "I stand because justice demands it. I stand because silence, however well-intentioned, is complicity. I stand because the abuse of power must be answered not with bitterness, but with truth, not with violence, but with accountability. The weight in the room thickened. The gallery silent, but for the slow, steady breathing of those holding themselves upright under the sheer force of what Graves had unleashed. "This country is capable of greatness," Graves said, his voice softer now, not pleading but reminding. "But greatness does not come from slogans. It comes from hard choices, from facing uncomfortable truths, from standing, even when it is easier to kneel to injustice and look the other way." He drew a deep, steadying breath, the final words forming like stone in his chest, before he gave them voice. "I forgive the men who wronged me," he said quietly, and a ripple of shock moved through the gallery, so sudden and unexpected that even the reporters forgot to lift their pens for a moment. But forgiveness is not forgetfulness. Forgiveness does not erase the need for justice. It does not erase the duty we all share to ensure that dignity, the dignity owed to every human being, without exception, is defended and preserved. He stepped back from the podium slowly, a solitary figure standing taller than the institution that had tried to diminish him. The judge inclined her head respectfully, her gavel resting silently beside her hand, as if acknowledging that there were moments even the law could only witness, not command. "Admiral Graves," she said, her voice quiet but formal, "your statement will be entered into the permanent record." Graves nodded once, and then, without looking at Calhoun, without sparing Maddox another glance, he turned and walked back to his seat. No applause broke the silence. None was needed. The truth had spoken for itself, and in that stillness something shifted. Not a shattering, but the first real crack in the old, comfortable lies that had held too long. Langston Graves sat once more, calm, composed, victorious not by conquest, but by the unyielding endurance of his dignity. The reckoning had begun. The verdicts were only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the echoes of the courtroom spilled out into the broader world with a force that no institution could ignore. What had begun as a single moment of brutality captured on a handful of shaky cell phones had evolved into something much larger. A national reckoning, a demand for accountability that neither tradition, nor hierarchy, nor the slow-moving machinery of bureaucracy could hold back. A sweeping federal audit of the entire United States Coast Guard was ordered, not by internal command, but by a joint directive from Congress and the Department of Justice. It was not a polite review, not a shallow, cosmetic nod to public anger. It was a full excavation, a cold, methodical dissection of the organization's procedures, its leadership, its hidden corridors of silence and impunity. Teams of investigators descended on district commands across the country, armed with subpoena power and political will sharpened by months of public outrage. Personnel files once thought buried were dragged into the open. Long-suppressed complaints were exhumed, catalogued, and laid bare. Whistleblowers, some long retired, and others still in uniform, came forward, their voices steady now that they knew they would be heard. It was not only the lower ranks that found themselves under scrutiny. Rear admirals, district commanders, legal officers, men and women who had long shielded themselves behind the insulating layers of tradition and secrecy, were summoned before committees, forced to account for decisions made in boardrooms far from the boats and harbors where ordinary Americans had been harassed and humiliated. The Coast Guard's public image, once carefully polished through rescue operations and ceremonial displays of patriotism, began to tarnish under the relentless weight of testimony and evidence. And yet, amid the painful revelations, there was a growing sense that something real, something lasting, was finally taking root. New oversight committees were installed, staffed not with political appointees, but with civilians, retired military officers of unblemished record, civil rights advocates, and legal scholars specializing in constitutional protections. Their mandate was broad and uncompromising: independent review of all harassment complaints, mandatory body camera policies for boarding operations, full transparency of internal investigations, and quarterly public reporting of disciplinary actions. It was not perfect. No reform ever was, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in too long, it was a beginning forged not in silence, but in truth. Langston Graves watched the unfolding transformation from a distance at first, not because he was disinterested, but because he understood that real change did not depend on the presence of a single man, no matter how deeply he had fought for it. He remained available, consulted frequently by congressional committees and military panels alike, but he refused every interview request, every profile, every offer to become the public face of the movement. He had not done what he had done for fame. He had done it for dignity, for justice, for the hundreds, the thousands, who would never know his name, but who would be safer, because he had refused to kneel. One evening, as the late summer sun painted the Potomac in shades of gold and fire, Graves sat in a quiet corner of the Navy Yard, his battered fishing hat in his lap, his gaze on the slow-moving river that had carried so many dreams and battles past its banks. Senator Maya Lattimore found him there, as she often did in those days when words seemed too small for the work still ahead. She approached without ceremony, lowering herself onto the bench beside him, her sharp suit jacket creasing slightly at the shoulders. "They want you to stay on," she said after a long moment, her voice quiet, respectful. Graves turned his head slightly, one eyebrow raised. "The new Oversight Commission," she clarified. "They want you to oversee the implementation. Full civilian authority. No rank, no chain of command to muzzle you." He was silent for a moment, considering. "They trust me now," he said, a faint trace of irony in his voice. "They don't have a choice," Lattimore replied, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "You earned that trust the hard way." He leaned back, letting the warmth of the evening sun soak into his skin, feeling the deep ache in his bones, an ache that had nothing to do with the bruises of a single day, and everything to do with the long, unrelenting march toward a better, more honest country. "I'll do it," Graves said finally. "Not because they asked. Because it needs to be done." Lattimore nodded once, a sharp, clean movement full of approval. "You'll have full authority," she said. "Access to everything. Final say on reforms." Graves chuckled softly, the sound low and without humor. "That's what they say now," he muttered. "We'll see how they feel when I start tearing out the rot by the roots." Lattimore's smile widened, but she said nothing, letting the moment settle between them. They sat there a while longer, two veterans of different battles, united by a simple, unyielding understanding. The work was never finished. Vigilance was never optional. But this victory, incomplete though it might be, was real, earned, carved from silence by the hands of a man who refused to be silenced. As the river flowed past, carrying the reflections of the Capitol's distant lights, Langston Graves tucked his fishing hat back over his head, rose slowly to his feet, and walked away from the water, not into retirement, but into a new kind of service, one where the uniform he wore would not be stitched with thread, but with truth. The ceremony was not held in a hidden room or behind closed doors. It was public, deliberately, symbolically, staged on the wide marble steps of the Capitol itself, under the full, unflinching eye of the nation. Langston Graves stood toward the back of the gathering, away from the clusters of politicians in dark suits and polished shoes, away from the reporters jostling for position near the barricades. He wore his simple civilian clothes, his shoulders straight beneath a modest navy jacket, his hands resting loosely behind his back. He wanted no podium, no spotlight. He had done what he set out to do. Today was for those who had been voiceless for far too long. The Secretary of Homeland Security stood stiffly at the podium, a thick sheaf of prepared remarks clutched in one hand, the other gripping the wooden sides as if seeking anchor. Cameras flashed. Broadcasters spoke in hushed, urgent tones. America was watching, and this time it would not look away. In light of the findings presented to Congress and confirmed through independent investigation, the secretary said, voice steady but hollow. We announce today the immediate termination of multiple senior officers within the United States Coast Guard found to have participated in, enabled, or concealed systemic abuses. He paused, clearing his throat, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of the camera's lenses. Additionally, sweeping reforms will be enacted to ensure transparency, accountability, and the restoration of public trust. A civilian oversight commission, chaired by decorated veterans and civil rights leaders, will hold full authority over internal reviews and disciplinary measures moving forward. There was no applause. No one cheered. The moment did not call for celebration, but for sober acknowledgement of what had been allowed to fester for too long. The secretary's next words, for all their polish, carried the heavy truth Graves had fought to carve into the national conscience. We issue a formal apology, he said, not only to Admiral Langston Graves, whose courage and dignity brought these issues to light, but to the hundreds of individuals whose voices were ignored, whose rights were trampled, whose dignity was denied. We failed you. We recognize that failure, and we vow to do better. A murmur stirred through the crowd, some quiet approval, some somber reflection. Graves remained still, watching, absorbing, measuring not the words themselves, but the sincerity. The cracks finally opened in the walls that had stood so long against justice. When the speeches ended, when the formalities were concluded, and the media swarmed forward seeking quotes, a cluster of politicians made their way toward him, all eager hands and eager smiles. Admiral Graves, one of them said, a congressman whose face was already becoming familiar from cable news appearances, we were hoping you might consider a run for office. The public trusts you. They need voices like yours. Others chimed in, offering platforms, support, a clear path paved by the momentum he had built through sacrifice and truth. Graves listened politely, his hands still clasped loosely behind him, his face composed. He let them speak, let them extend their offers like merchants at market stalls, each trying to sell him a future they thought he should want. When they finished, he spoke quietly, firmly, with the same unshakable clarity that had carried him through every battle, every betrayal. I didn't do this to build a career, Graves said. I did this because it was right, because dignity demanded it. He shook his head slowly, not in anger, but in resolute peace. I have no interest in power, he continued, only in making sure no one else has to fight this battle alone again. The politicians, caught off guard by the simplicity of his refusal, nodded awkwardly and withdrew, their smiles tightening, their hands retreating to their pockets. Graves turned back toward the steps, looking out over the crowd gathering beyond the barricades, citizens young and old, veterans in worn uniforms, families holding signs with faces and names of those who had suffered in silence. He found himself smiling, not broadly, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew he had stayed true to himself when it would have been easier to compromise. Langston Graves tucked his hands into the pockets of his jacket, turned away from the flash of cameras, and walked down the marble steps into the crowd. Not above them, not before them, but among them. Because dignity was not a prize to be won. It was a burden to be carried, and he carried it still, with the same unbreakable grace that no courtroom, no confrontation, no injustice could ever strip away. And for the first time in a long time, the nation moved forward with him. The water stretched wide and open before him, calm and endless beneath the slow arc of a setting sun. The tide moved with lazy confidence, the gentle slap of waves against the hull creating a steady rhythm that spoke of peace, not urgency. Langston Graves sat at the stern of his modest fishing boat, one hand resting casually on the rail, the other loosely holding a rod whose line danced in the current. He wore no uniform today, No ribbons pinned to his chest, no medals gleaming under the sky. Just a simple windbreaker, faded jeans, a well-worn ball cap pulled low over his brow. A man not defined by rank or history, but by something deeper and quieter, the knowledge of who he was, and the battles he had chosen to fight. Around him, laughter floated across the water. His niece, no more than 10 years old, leaned precariously over the edge of the boat, trying to spot the fish they had only just begun to chase. His brother-in-law teased her from the other side, cautioning her with exaggerated warnings about falling in, drawing another chorus of giggles. Even Senator Maya Lattimore, coaxed away from Washington for a rare afternoon off, sat cross-legged on a folding chair, her shoes kicked off, sleeves rolled up, smiling at some private joke shared between her and Graves's sister. It was a different kind of gathering now. No reporters, no microphones, no flashing cameras. Those had faded weeks ago, absorbed into the endless churn of the news cycle. Other scandals had taken their place. Other fights had demanded the public's attention. Graves had let them go willingly, stepping out of the glare, content to leave the headlines behind and return to something simpler, something that mattered more than attention ever could. The work had not ended, of course. The civilian oversight committees had begun their labor, painstaking and necessary. Reforms moved slowly, like icebergs shifting course, but they moved all the same. Some resisted, clinging to the old ways, but the ground beneath them had changed forever, and they could no longer pretend otherwise. Graves would rejoin that work in time. His new position, senior civilian advisor on institutional reform, awaited him in the coming months, and he would lend his hand to shaping a new generation of service, one rooted in integrity rather than fear. But not today. Today was for the open water, for the tug of the line against the current, for the warm sun on his shoulders, and the soft, unhurried conversations of people who knew him not as a symbol, not as a story, but simply as Langston. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the boat rock gently beneath him, and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the wind carry the scents of salt and seaweed across his face. He thought about the long road that had brought him here, the injustice, the confrontation, the hard, grinding labor of standing against an institution that had, for too long, mistaken tradition for righteousness. He thought about the faces of those who had testified alongside him, the families who had suffered in silence and who now found their stories written into the fabric of public memory where they could never again be erased. But most of all, he thought about dignity. It was never something given by medals or titles, never something granted by courts or ceremony. It was a quiet, steady flame carried in the heart, protected not by strength of arm, but by strength of spirit. It was the refusal to bow when bowing would be easy. It was the decision, over and over again, to stand firm when standing alone was the harder path. That, he knew, was the real victory. The line in his hands jerked suddenly, pulling against his fingers with sharp insistence. His niece shrieked in excitement, rushing over with wide, eager eyes as he chuckled and began to reel it in, the laughter of his family filling the air and washing over the deck like music. He handed her the rod with a wink, steadying her small hands with his own as she fought the pull of the fish below, her face lit with fierce determination. "Easy," he said softly, guiding her grip. "You don't win by fighting harder. You win by holding on." She nodded, gritting her teeth with the single-minded focus of youth, and together they pulled the fish into the boat, a glistening arc of silver and life landing with a wet slap against the deck. Cheers erupted, a spontaneous chorus of celebration that echoed across the still waters. Langston Graves smiled, not the small, guarded smile of duty fulfilled, but the deep, unguarded smile of a man who had found something greater than vindication. Peace. He leaned back again as the sun dipped lower toward the horizon, the world painted in shades of gold and fire. the boat rocking gently beneath him. The fight was not forgotten. It never would be. But for now, he had earned this moment, and he intended to savor it, knowing with absolute certainty that he had stood firm, that he had held the line, and that, in the end, dignity had prevailed. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.